It's day 20 of World Watercolor Month. How's it going for you? Today's prompt is wet and dry. And when I heard the words wet and dry, I immediately started thinking not of topics, but of techniques, because wet and dry techniques in watercolor can create a varied beautiful arrangement of techniques to create texture and fluidity in your paintings. Used properly, wet and dry techniques can make your paintings really come to life. And yet they're one of the first things that new artists struggle to master. And it can feel really intimidating to start to learn how to manage the water movement and the water flow in your paintings. I want to show you something, a little technique that just brought a light bulb on in my head when I started to think about brush water load and how much water to use in my paintings. Let's take a look at my work surface. What I'm about to show you I think is going to shed a little bit of light if you've been struggling with how much water to use in your paintings. These two paintings are part of my World Watercolor Month special course. This is a step-by-step lesson in painting 3 different paintings. These are just 2 of them, using loose and fluid watercolor techniques with no pencil sketching beforehand. You can check those out on my website at learn.angelafehr.com.
During World Watercolor Month, 10% of the sales of this course will be donated to the Dreaming Zebra Foundation. Enroll today.
I wanted to show you these 2 paintings though because they both use loose and fluid watercolor techniques. However, they do not use any one single technique. You cannot paint a painting just using wet on wet techniques, for example, and have any kind of dimension in your painting. When we want to have some little lines and contrasts between hard and soft edges, we need to use wet on dry techniques as well. So when you hear somebody asking about whether or not an artist is using wet and wet in their painting, the answer is probably yes, but it's going to be part of their toolkit of many other techniques that they're using to create their painting. We are going to talk a little bit about water load because I think it's really critical to having a successful painting. And I want to show you just a few different things to look for in how to manage the amount of water on your brush. The paper I'm using today is Kilimanjaro watercolor paper. It's a 140-pound cold press paper made by Cheap Joe's Art Stuff. And this is a 100% cotton paper, and the texture of it is really quite lovely. From what I'm seeing as I'm working with it, it's really standing up. It's performing as well as the name brand artist quality papers that I've used. So I'm really happy to see that. We're going to just make a little puddle here. I'm just adding a little moisture to my pigment, and this is American Journey watercolors, also made by Cheap Joe's Art Stuff. And Cheap Joe's is one of the sponsors of my Watercolor Summer Challenge, which is going on right now. You can take a look at this week's giveaway and all the great prizes that are available this week and in our grand prize at the end of the month by visiting watercolorsummerchallenge.com. So I've just used a nice juicy amount of pigment to place my little square of ultramarine blue here on my paper. I left a little dot there. And it's nice and shiny and moist. Excess water and pigment is always going to want to migrate either to the lowest spot if your paper starts to buckle, which sometimes it does, or to the edge of the space you've defined. So you can see there's a bit of a bead of color happening right here at the edge of the paper. What you want to see happen if you're looking for a smooth wash is to choose colors that are non-granulating. In this case, I'm using ultramarine blue, so it is a granulating color. And as it starts to dry, you'll see the little pigment particles start to collect in the little hollows in the paper. And that I actually like. I love granulation in my paint, so I don't worry too much about getting those perfectly smooth washes if I can get some texture created through granulation. If your wash is, so that's a pigment property, but there's also the fluid properties of color. So if your amount of water on your paper isn't perfectly even, the color won't have a chance to evenly spread and disperse across your painting. Where I really notice this is when you're painting a square, something like this, and the color starts to be absorbed and the water starts to dry and the painting starts losing its sheen, it's a little less moist than it was a few minutes ago. So if I decide I want to extend this area of my painting to get that ultramarine blue to spread out, I might start painting over here on this side to extend that area. And we'll do a little along here too. Now there's a very strong possibility that I might run into a couple of problems. One problem might be is if I'm using more moisture on this side than I have on this side, and that's going to create an imbalance of moisture. And when you have an imbalance of water on your paper, and I'm going to try and exaggerate it a bit here, you'll have, here you can start to see the puddle there. And when that imbalance starts to creep, and I'm encouraging it a bit, but when it starts to creep into that drying wash, the drying wash is going to resist it to some extent. The drier this is, the harder it is for fresh pigment to smoothly glide across the surface. We want our moisture to be able to float on the surface. And if it's not floating on the surface, for example, say I decide to add, maybe introduce a new color here into this area here, and I do it with a nice wet brush because I really want it to spread and fill and be, and I know this is drying, so I think a little extra water will help with that. But what's going to start to happen is as this paper dries, this new pigment and this new amount of moisture that's more than the moisture that's already here is going to push against that old moisture and that pigment that was starting to soak into the paper. And it's going to start to create a bloom. And sometimes this will happen because there's maybe a puddle of water at the edge of the paper because you used lots of water and pigment and it all migrated to the side. And then it wants to kind of flow back into this side of the painting. And so then we've got this little puddle starting to happen. And all of those imbalances of water make it very difficult for the color to smoothly dry across the painting. You might just start to see a bloom emerge, and a bloom is when we have, I'm going to try to make one here. A bloom is when we have new water or new pigment pushing against that old pigment, and where the new water and the drying paper meet, you might start to see an edge become visible. And so that creates a bloom. And this little puddle here, as it dries, it's going to take a lot longer to dry than the paper around it. So it's going to start creating a bloom, maybe not right now, but maybe half an hour or 1 hour from now. As after I've walked away to let everything dry, and I'm not here to notice that this part that's drying so much more slowly is pushing against this part that's dried already and creating those edges. So suddenly my even and smooth wash that looked nice when I left, those puddles of pigment are doing stuff when I'm not even in the room. And with watercolor that happens. So we want to look for ways to paint with an even amount of liquid. So I like to think about having, when I first start painting, I want to have a juicy brush. My brush right now, I've just dipped it in the water. It's saturated, but it's not dripping. It's loaded with water. It is ready to release onto the paper. I can do that with clear water and release that water. It wants to leave the brush and spread across the paper. Or I can load my brush with pigment. Let's use the phthalo blue this time. And I can have my brush absolutely full and saturated with pigment that's very willing to leave my brush and fill the paper. When my brush is thirsty, that means I've rinsed it, I've blotted out the moisture. I don't squash it. I'm usually very gentle with my brush, but I've removed enough moisture from it that it's thirsty. It wants to absorb fresh moisture. I can use that to lift color, and this is going to lift a lot of color. I can use that to lift and remove moisture from my painting. So if I see that puddle happening, I can reverse it, stop it in its tracks, or at least slow it down so that I don't get that bloom that was threatening to happen. It's still threatening over in these two corners. And then I can also paint with a neutral brush. So when I go to my painting, I can note very carefully the amount of moisture that's on the paper already, and I can anticipate how much liquid to put on my brush so that I can continue what I already started without creating those blooms. And this is where experience becomes really helpful, because the more you paint, the more you're going to be able to be comfortable with anticipating how much water to use. Here I don't have it perfect. This area was starting to dry a little bit, and you can see just a hint of a line here. And so fortunately, it's not too late to just smooth the color straight across there. But I look for ways to work with a neutral brush, a brush that is balanced and in response to what is already happening on the paper. And the other thing you want to do, you have those 3 options for how to use your brush and how much water to use. And the 4th thing you want to do is know when to stop and back away. Because there are times when a loaded brush will add too much water, we'll get that bloom that I talked about. A thirsty brush will lift so much color and moisture that now we have a bare spot in our painting. And a neutral brush, it just really can't be neutral and add fresh pigment if the paper is already almost so dry that you really can't have a neutral brush when the paper is almost dry. Once it loses its sheen, stops being shiny, and starts to get kind of the look of a damp paper towel, that's when it's time to stop, put the brakes on, and observe what's going to happen. It's very hard to match the moisture in a nearly dry piece of paper. And if you can't match the moisture, it's very hard to create smooth washes and layers of color. Think about what your brush is bringing to your painting as you're creating those techniques, and you'll be much better able to anticipate when you're going to get blooms, when you're going to lift pigment and color, and when you're going to create that beautiful even flow that you're looking for. I'm going to be talking more about large and small scale wet and wet painting techniques in my lesson video on watercolorsummerchallenge.com. Head over there and check it out. And wherever you're at in your watercolor, whatever you think you know about using water and pigment in your paintings, just keep painting. The more you paint, the more you know.